Hello and welcome to episode 3 of season 2, or the second year of AS for Architecture, with me, Ambrose Gillick. In this episode, I'm joined by the head of the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University, Professor Juliet Davis, to talk about her new book, The Caring City, Ethics of Urban Design, published by Bristol University Press this year.
One thing that I really wrestled with was the notion of uncare, because to me it seemed that uncare needs as much theorising, if you like, thinking about what is uncare. If we think about what an uncaring city is or would be, then that can actually help to think about what care might be.
AS for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to Juliet Davis. Juliet, would you be so... Sorry, I'll correct that. Professor Juliet Davis. Juliet, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ambrose. Thanks very much for having me. So, as you've already said, I'm Juliet Davis. I'm a recent professor in the School of Architecture here in Cardiff University. I began my career in architecture a long time ago, back in the early 1990s, when I studied architecture at Cambridge. I went through all of the different parts, the part 1, part 2, part 3.
All at Cambridge?
No, I did the first 2 parts at Cambridge, and then I did the third part once I was in practice in London. So I did that at the South Bank University. And I worked in practice for 9 years, for 2 years with Stanton Williams Architects, and then the rest of the time with Eric Parry Architects. Although by the time I left Eric Parry's, I was already had been teaching for a couple of years at Cambridge. So I began to segue my way into academia, really driven initially by a love of teaching, and a love of engaging with students, and recognizing the privilege of being able to talk about ideas and develop ideas, and set challenges and engage with a wide range of different sites. And then later on, once I started doing my PhD, by a real love of thinking, theorizing, looking at urban issues particularly. I became an urbanist through my research, which I carried out at PhD level at the London School of Economics, studying with Professor Fran Tonkis, who was my supervisor, but also learning from a wide range of other people at the LSE at that time, including Richard Sennett and Ricky Burdett. So then I, by 2012, I'd finished that and came to Cardiff at that stage.
So you did a PhD by research, not whilst in practice, but as a kind of a pure academic thing?
I did, yes. I got an AHRC doctoral award, which allowed me to do the PhD full time over 3 years. And I just about, I didn't manage to quite finish it in 3 years. It took me nearly 4 in the end. But yeah, it was wonderful to have that funding. That was a real privilege to be able to really focus on the PhD for a concerted period of time.
So Cambridge, I know a little of Cambridge. I've spoken to a number of guests who've gone to Cambridge University, studied architecture there. What's the atmosphere there like? Because architecture schools obviously have their kind of school language, and Cambridge is quite contextual. Am I right in thinking that? Is that a fair way of putting it?
I think that is probably quite a fair way of putting at it.
It's it's not focused on bioclimatic, and it's not focused on, digital, progressive digital ideas, but it's kind of, contextual and continuity. Is it historicist in its tendency?
I don't think so particularly. I mean, there was a very strong emphasis on phenomenology at the time that I was there, and there was a very strong and clear focus on history and theory. History and theory wasn't assessed through the studio, but nonetheless there was a strong relationship between teaching and history and theory, and the kind of design projects that were set. I mean, I've never forgotten my moment of arriving at Cambridge University for the open day, because up until then, as a 17-year-old, various people had said that my wide-ranging interests would lend themselves quite well to architecture. And I kept resisting it. I thought that architecture was engineering. I thought that it wasn't what I was interested in at that time, which was fine art, drawing, painting, and so on. And I went to this open day and saw a whole range of drawings on the wall that were absolutely distinctive and really reflected what was known as the Cambridge style at that time, of quite layered and worked drawings, quite dark drawings in many ways, but as a result of the sheer layering of information and design development that had been worked into them, and then with a sheet of glass on top of each, and typically an axonometric or a detailed section over the top, which was supposed to reflect how design development happens, the sort of iterative process, the imagination of place and atmosphere, of use, and then building up to some sort of resolution in terms of a more hardline drawing. And as soon as I saw that set, I thought, that's me, that I can do. And so began the journey.
That's amazing. So a very sort of theoretically driven, I mean, phenomenology is no walk in the park. So a very theoretically undergirded undergraduate leads naturally to, how does that play out in practice? I mean, did you find working at Stanton Williams and Eric Parry? I mean, Eric Parry is a very thoughtful architect. I don't know much about Stanton Williams, but other than they're very prolific and well known. How does a very kind of theoretically driven architecture emerge in their work, and how did you kind of?
Oh, well,
I mean, obviously as a part one, you don't get to do that much, but maybe as a part 2, 3, you get more of a.
Well, actually, I did get to do quite a lot at Stanton Williams. I mean, I think I had the experience that probably a lot of part one students have, of not really having a clear sense of what to expect. And so I was constantly somewhere between being frightened and being humiliated, on being frightened at being asked to do things that I had absolutely no clear conception of, didn't know what I was supposed to do, and felt that I ought to and wasn't sure how to ask questions, and then making the tea for meetings and jobs of that ilk, that made me wonder why I'd done a degree. So I think that was my predominant experience, at least of my first year in practice with Stanton Williams as a part one student. And as a result of that, I stayed in practice for second year, or at least in part. I had a scholarship which didn't work out in the end, and that was disappointing. So I felt that I needed a second year to think about things, but also to make sure that I felt a little bit more settled in practice than I felt when I first went into it. And actually, it was great to have done so, because just at the end of my that first year, I started working on the regeneration of the National Theatre in London on the South Bank. And because I'd been there for a little while and I knew the team members by then, I actually ended up having an amazing role, and working my way through a whole series of interiors, including bars and ice cream stations and seating areas, and then concrete cleaning packages and things like that were really enjoyable. And in those days, of course, a lot of the design work was done in pencil. In fact, most of the drawings that were involved were drawn in crisp pencil on A1 sheets of tracing paper, although the office was introducing CAD at the same time, and as one of the youngsters at that time and in the team, I was able to play an important role there as well. Nice. So I went back to university feeling much more confident, much more on top of things.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you become a theorist. So through this bit, I mean, I'm really interested in Fran Tompkins and Ricky Burdett and Richard Sennett as well. I mean, doing a PhD in architecture through their cities program, is that right?
Yeah.
And what was that like? I mean, I've often wondered about that. I don't know much about the cities program, to be honest. And how does that focus? How does that engage with architecture? Or is that specifically at a sort of at a larger level? Is that a more meso level kind of rather than the micro level of architecture?
Well, I think again, the reason for going there was very much because my perceptions of the cities program from people that I'd worked with who'd done master's courses there, and from what I knew of some of the people that taught there, including Richard Sennett, whose work I had engaged with as an undergraduate student and absolutely loved. The Fall of Public Man, and then later The Uses of Disorder. I mean, those are two books that would absolutely be at the top of my pile. Even now. So there was no doubt that, at least from what I understood from the outside, that the cities program really resonated with my interests. But then, I
mean, what was your thesis? What was your thesis on?
Well, I'll say so. At the time, I was living in East London. And one of the things that I always loved about East London, and it resonated for another reason, which is that I grew up in South America, and when I moved to East London, the multiculturalism of East London felt very familiar, and I felt right at home there. And so I became really fascinated as East London was changing in the late 1990s. And early 2000s, and then particularly after London won the bid for the 2012 Olympic Games, I became really fascinated in what regeneration and planned regeneration particularly, and in, therefore what urban design architecture would do to the place and how it would interface with the kind of social life and complexity of East London as I inhabited it and knew it at the time.
Yeah.
So that became that relationship between the spatial and the social, which I think is really key to the cities program, key to how the program was conceived, and key to the idea of having a city centre in a sociology department. Was the sort of was what I wanted to explore. So
and had that been a change? I mean, was the LSE program distinct in that? I was going to ask you what's an urbanist, but because it's a fair question, because I think for architects particularly, there's an assumption around what urban design is, which is possibly problematic insofar as we tend to be object orientated, and urban design isn't about objects so much as it is the bits between the objects, maybe. But was what LSE was doing at the time particular? Was it new? Was it sort of indicative of a new movement in the way that we consider cities?
Well, I think that what was very powerful was bringing together urban analysis and understandings of cities of the sort that social scientists develop with the kind of approaches that designers have. I mean, it made me very conscious that site analysis, what we call site analysis, at least at that time, and I think generally a research agenda has made research methods and research methodology much more prominent in architecture schools. But from my background in the 1990s and the early 2000s, that was not really present at all. And there wasn't really much training in how one goes about looking at places and the sort of subjectivity of one's gaze and all those sorts of questions, which I got exposed to at the LSE and were incredibly valuable. Would have been very valuable if I had gone back into practice at that point, and have been very valuable for thinking about, I guess, some of the impacts of planning and of design in the places that I've been looking at.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think this combination of sociology and design, I think, is an incredibly rich area. And you've been doing it for a while. I mean, you're obviously beaten a lot of people to the punch in that respect, but it's still slowly being revealed. And there's kind of pushback, isn't there, in the way that certain parts of cities are still being, particularly London, still being developed in a kind of very, maybe you could describe it as anti-sociological way, a kind of imposition of infrastructure on communities. Thinking here maybe of course of the London Docklands development, but even the City of London. And I was reading in your book, and we'll come to this, I'll introduce this properly in a second, the work that's been being done around the Shard and Borough and Bermondsey, where there's an absolute absence of kind of voice.
Yeah, exactly. And often not a very good grasp of the actual people who live there or who work there, which is really key. So, in fact, I was reading about this just yesterday in relation to the Olympic site, reading an author's account of the way in which the employment legacy of the Olympics was conceived. And one of the key issues that's identified in the text is a difficulty in really getting a handle on the who, the exact who. Who are the beneficiaries? How is local person defined? What are other readings of the local? And and therefore, what are some of the problems of these sort of fairly general generic characterizations of people in places that become the focus of regeneration? Often metrics such as indices of deprivation are used, but without attending closely enough, I would argue, to anything like closely enough to some of the assets and strengths that exist in those very places, including what some of the needs are of those people and the places that they inhabit. And to approach transformation or regeneration from that perspective would inevitably yield a completely different sort of urban environment, as well as a completely different sort of process of reaching it.
I think that's a really, I was thinking about this recently with regards some of the words that we use around urban poverty. I've been doing some small research projects around the North Kent coast and the Channel region on this. And again, it comes back to this point that you make, which is that defining the terms by which you then characterize people's need themselves is very difficult. Like the word marginalization or marginal is an extremely external value judgment that's sort of dressed up in languages of justice, but actually implies, as I read it, as I experience it, a whole series of judgments about whether these people, because of their socioeconomic status, because of their general deprivation status, can have profound and beautiful lives. And as a researcher, I think I'd still struggle with this, because you go in like a white knight on a horse to solve problems. But they're problems based around a series of words which you're applying them, so, that might not even be real to the people that live there. Like, for example, as you say, poverty, which is difficult. Anyway, we are talking here today about, and I'm delighted that you wanted to do this because of this book that you published in 2000, and well, it's this year. Bristol University Press has published your book, The Caring City: Ethics of Urban Design, which is a really good book because it's really focused on design. So this comes back, and this long preamble that we've had, me trying to understand, I suppose, how you get to this point, this idea of a situated, contextual, rich picture, to use a sociology term, rich picture of what architecture and urban design can do. But you're looking at the idea of care ethics. And I think that's, even though that might seem marginal to architectural descriptions for perhaps most of the listeners to this podcast, perhaps it would be worth starting off by you explaining the background to that particular idea, this idea of care and what we mean by care, and how in your book you interpret and perhaps transform this idea. And then we can talk about how it's revealed in the urban realm.
Sure, yeah. So
what is care?
Care is something that we all need, and care is something that we all receive, and care is something that is absolutely fundamental to human continuity. I suppose those are things to say at the beginning, because a lot of people won't have heard of care ethics, and particularly in the context of architecture. So that can seem to sort of hive it off into a remote little area of scholarship, and perhaps rather abstract and distant from the reality of practice. Although I've been very glad to see ethics come to occupy more centre ground in ways of thinking about how architectural curricula should and might develop. So focusing on not just on the duty of care, but on different moral theories that could help to understand what it is that designers do in the world, and why what they do is or might be good. So, but to just come back to the first point about care, I mean, it's everybody is cared for as a baby, and most people require care at the end of life, and throughout life, what care involves and what it and who it involves inevitably changes, from the sort of care of friends to the care of for young people, the care of other adults, the care that teachers give, the care that doctors give. Care is kind of in the mix of everyone's lives, and I think it's only really because we tend to, or not we personally, but as a society, we've tended to marginalize care and put it in the background, not really see it as center stage, by comparison to other activities like building a career, for example, or that it could even seem like it's something that's of marginal concern.
But we saw that a lot. We saw that a lot during lockdown, where you had the kind of the care worker, sort of characterized as both vulnerable and the worst of all people, and care environments as being the nexus of disease and great problems. So like the whole notion of care, I mean, the word itself is now bound up in a kind of discourse around a really problematic series of assumptions and value judgments.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, care ethics is has been seen as problematic, if you like, in terms of how it has dealt with that, and how it recognizes the ways in which care is practiced, and the problems of the way that care is practiced, wherever that is, whether it's formal care in the context of care homes and hospitals and so on, or whether it's more informal care that takes place in neighborhoods and families and so forth. So over the years, as care ethics has evolved, I mean, this is probably coming on to what we'll talk about later, but as care ethics has evolved, it's been tuned to be able to acknowledge those issues of care, those problems of care, those ways in which care is less than it might be, and less effective, and less able to deliver what is the outcome of good care, which is that people thrive and flourish. And I guess that's a really key starting point, that urban design generally are often positioned as practices that are about creating a better space, a better future, a better kind of stage, if you like, for human well-being and flourishing. So there's an alignment there between ways of thinking about care as a practice, so taken out of particular settings like the care home and so on, but care in much more general terms, and what design might or could do.
So your book sets out, you start and you go back to, so this is all entirely new to me. this whole literature that which makes it very rich and obviously difficult in some ways because it's a new literature. But you talk about Carol Gilligan in 1982 develops this idea of an ethics of care. So this is a first step in establishing it as an imperative in a way, giving it a care, a status that it hadn't at that point had, and then establishing it as something that we have a moral obligation or an ethical obligation to take into account when we're dealing with social conditions, and in your case in urban conditions. And then you use this as a way of interrogating the urban realm in terms of its efficacy of producing or not producing care, and you find it wanting essentially, don't you?
Yeah, well, I guess what I try to do is I think about how care is relevant and how we can think about care in terms of urban design. And I'm particularly keen to not just think about care in terms of particular typologies. So, the care home, particular types of care spaces that have already been identified and that people would naturally turn to, but to rather think about different approaches to urban design and what they do in general terms, in terms of care. So, care is placed, for example, as I argue in my third chapter. Care is placed by all sorts of ways of locating housing, housing for more vulnerable groups, for children, for the elderly, and has been historically too. I mean, we all know that hospitals are often placed outside city gates, partly for fear of contagion, and partly for other image-related reasons as well. Places there are all sorts of, whether we're talking about tuberculosis sanatoria or other kinds of spaces for healthcare. It's interesting to consider where they were located and why that was the case. And I think that there's been a real turn in recent times to, and the projects that I've chosen clearly to illustrate that, clearly really demonstrate that, but to thinking about how care can be urbanized, how it can be integrated, how care can be recognized in a broader sense, so that housing as in general can be seen as an infrastructure of care. And how different sorts of care practices across families and different age groups and even in the neighborhood can potentially come together and enable us maybe to start to think about a society as able to be caring and responsive, or at least alert to the different sorts of needs and vulnerabilities that people have.
So I really like this word placed, because it sounds very simple, but it indicates that it is considered and that it is a active action rather than the manifestation of organic processes. So people are placing care facilities, as you say, sanatoria and hospitals and so on, in places that indicate, and you go through this in your book, you develop this thesis in your book, which is that, as you've been saying, care is more needs to be more holistically considered within the wider environment. And I was wondering whether, so your book argues for care, implying that modern, shall we say, post-war, I don't know what the time frame might be, urban form, urban design, urbanism has not placed care, or has placed care badly. Is that the case? Is it indifference, or is it actual malintent in some kind of way? I mean,
Well,
these people aren't wicked, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's a really good question, and actually, I think there are always things that one wrestles with in writing a book. Well, many things that one might wrestle with. The least problematic thing is the initial idea. The problem then is the development of it. And one thing that I really wrestled with was the notion of uncare. Because to me it seemed that uncare needs as much theorizing, if you like, thinking about what is uncare. If we think about what an uncaring city is or would be, then that can actually help to think about what care might be. So I spent quite a bit of time wrestling with that, but in the end made the decision that my focus was on grappling with the notion of care and thinking about it in an urban context, and that was enough for one monograph, because there was really so much to say, and it meant drawing on so many different literatures from different fields. I mean, I was I was in different libraries around the university here, which just highlighted that. I spent a lot of time over in the Arts and Humanities, Social Sciences library. And then back here in the architecture library and other places too. It was very interdisciplinary. So I took that on as my challenge to really think about the caring city. I think a really important model for me in that regard was Susan Feinstein's book, The Just City, where she set out to do a similar sort of thing. Reading The Just City really did help to think through what I was trying to do. And she thinks about concepts of justice, different ways of theorizing justice. And then she takes that into the context of planning theory, and then considers what the areas are or what the themes are where, justice is most relevant. So I think that's what I'm trying to do as well, although my themes are a bit different. But I'm trying to think about where in quite general terms, care really relates to what urban design is about and what it engages with. And the themes that I set out, again, are partly driven by the length of a book. There are other themes that could be identified. They're not comprehensive. They're beginning to set out a territory.
Yeah, but there is there is a kind of so there isn't an extensive critique through the perspective of uncare, which I think is quite a useful word. But there is, nonetheless, you kind of take this idea of care and you explain how later theorists of care have challenged, particularly around this idea of, I suppose you might call it the alienation of modernity, challenged the idea of perhaps the individuation of modernity, which is one of Peter Berger's characteristics in his book Facing Up to Modernity. In one of the essays in there, he talks about individuation as one of these principal characteristics, which other theorists, of course, have written about. And what you're talking about when you talk about care is a specifically almost anti-individualistic, relational, social idea. And you also talk about it in relation to gender as well, which I think is quite interesting. And I was wondering if you could just perhaps talk a little bit about that how we've moved from this kind of, I don't know how to put it. I don't know what the right word is. I mean, there's lots of kind of easy words that you could throw at it, which might not be very meaningful. But how do we get to this point? So what are they trying to say? And where does this come from, in a way?
Well, I think it's really, there are lots of questions in that. So I'm just
sorry.
The first one, which is about the universality, I guess is the dominant theme. So yeah, I modular man, for example, in Le Corbusier's work is the real model of that kind of thinking, a tendency to try and distill the person down to general principles, which is antithetical to care, with its focus on situated, concrete reality, including the situation of the person as they perceive it themselves, which is really where the care thinking begins to tie back to my early undergraduate years and exposure to phenomenology, because I think that emphasis on situation is shared across those different theories and ways of thinking. So it's definitely a plug for a kind of design that is alert to, not necessarily to just to particular individuals, because of course people are always moving through urban spaces, and the built environment always lasts longer than the inhabitation of individuals. So it's not so much actual individuals as a consciousness of difference and relations, an awareness of how things change, and a strong focus on the particularities of a place, and the way that it is configured, which again ties back to what I was worrying about and became bothered about when I first joined the LSE, and was looking at comprehensive redevelopment related to the Olympics in East London.
But I suppose there's a great answer to a series of somewhat messy questions. There is, in the literature of care, as I read it, a preponderance, shall we say, or there's a lot of female authors. There are some men, but it's predominantly in the literature that you've cited, particularly in the theorists around ethics of care. And I wondered whether there was something about that was worth emphasizing, that there's I think you do talk about it, don't you, that there's this idea, well, for a start, in sort of public, I don't know if public is the right word, but in kind of general discourse around care is something that women do, which is one of the reasons why it is perhaps held in low esteem, because it doesn't correspond to wage laboring, doesn't correspond to salaries, doesn't correspond to promotion. No mother ever got promoted, except for perhaps Kate Middleton. But so there is a distinct, as I was reading it, a relationship between womanhood and a movement towards a more caring ethic, which then we could see is used as a mechanism for interrogating the uncaringness of cities and how we could make them more caring. Is that me reading too much into it, or is that something that's there as well?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's another thing to add to that, which is that there's a great book, and I haven't read it for a while, so I suddenly can't remember exactly what it's called. It's by Michael Fine, and he makes some really useful points about the private nature of care as opposed to the public nature of care.
Right.
And I think that coming back to what we talked about at the start, about the emphasis on care homes and places like that, and on care in the home indeed, and so on, we've continued in the architectural profession and more broadly in design to think about care as something that happens in interiors, in houses, and so on. And of course that's really important. And but what that neglects is the broader care, the kind of broader care that all should be responsible for and all are involved in, and that cities are involved in too. You know, if children breathe in bad quality air and it affects their health for the rest of their lives, then that's actually care as a public issue. It's not just care that is in with it set within the confines of an individual home or household. It's not just to do with care in the family. It's care in a much broader societal sense that involves a really complex and wide-ranging set of actors. And in fact, that just, if I may, just to sort of digress, that's another thing that I really wrestled with in writing the book, how to really focus it. So, whether to call it urbanism, urban design was part of that struggle, because I was really conscious of that when you talk about projects that like streets, or when you talk about shaping air quality and that sort of thing, these are really complex undertakings, and they involve many different actors, and they serve to highlight how incredibly relational, if you like, city making is. So in the end, I decided to focus on urban design, because that's one strand, if you like, of the making. It's a materialization of the city, and that brings and clusters all these different actors around it, because urban design is realized through planning processes, is enabled by government, gets backing and support, is financed in particular ways. And the projects themselves became ways to touch on all of that and to sort of highlight the relationality and thereby, if it's not getting too complex, to show that when we think about care, any kind of set of care relations that is unfolding in space, that actually it relates to all of those complex networks of actors. They're all part of those care relations. So I hope that that's what the case studies help to show, as well as to highlight something about architecture and design, that it's very far from being about the lone genius, the problems that we've had in architectural education for such a long time, that we've continued through our teaching practices to emphasize an idea of my project, my ideas, and the primacy of that. Whereas in fact, perhaps we should be teaching something much more to do with the relationality of the context that students will go into in practice, and by engaging with that, to really understand the nature of responsibility and the incredibly collaborative nature of urban production.
I think, we struggle with our students with getting them to even consider doing group work. And we obviously have to have them do group work. And it's something to do with the marks. But it's also something to do with, I think, the fact that no part of their education up till that point has really emphasized collaboration in their primary or secondary education. They might do playing in the sandpit together at kindergarten, but after that, there is a definite process towards individualization of all education. Then you bring them into university and say, guys, it's all collaborative. And there's no preparation for it at all, and it becomes very, very difficult thing to do. But this idea of the co-productive quality, or the synthetic quality of the urban realm, I think it's really beautifully described. And as I said at the beginning, the case studies that you use, you describe in a very architectural way. And it's one of the things I particularly liked about this book. It's very scholarly and theory-driven, theory underpinned, but it is also a book that helps us understand how caring urban space and caring architecture can occur. And I was wondering if there were any particular case studies that you felt were perhaps the most transparently illustrative, from the urban scale to perhaps the architectural scale within the cases that you picked.
Oh, well, I fell in love with all of them. And I think, you
even went down to see Aravina's stuff in Ecuador. Is it Ecuador?
No, I didn't go to Ecuador.
Did you not?
I would have loved to have gone to Ecuador. I didn't though. I went to India. I went to Aranya in India.
Aranya housing, yes, of course.
And that was absolutely that was a fantastic trip.
That's Balkrishna Doshi's Aranya housing.
But I think it's worth saying that I wrote quite a lot of it in lockdown. So at a time when, for all of us parents with busy lives, care and work were just completely conflated. So whether that helped or not, I'm not sure, but certainly it made me think a lot about care and how on earth one might combine in the same space caring responsibilities with trying to think. and I couldn't go to any of the case studies during that time, so I had to rely on all the data that I had to hand. But the other thing that I did, and perhaps it was because of not being able to go anywhere, but I read a huge number of novels during the time that I was writing the book, and part of that was to try and get a sense of narrative into the case studies, to try and sort of imbibe a sense of narrative through my reading, and to tell them as stories that, that hopefully people could enjoy. So while thinking about the theory and about what care might mean in the context of these different themes and different settings, cities, case studies, that they might also just enjoy something of the story of how those ideas had come together and how the places had unfolded, because I felt that was absolutely essential. Care is always a process; it's not a fixed thing. It's not something that can be ticked. It's something that relies on the process and that brings together constantly a sort of process of making, a process of living, of maintaining. I
like this idea of being inspired by novels, which are, of course, about relationships. Fundamentally, aren't they? Isn't that the sort of fundamental difference between a novel and other types of literature, is that it's about the kind of social relationships, to be inspired by that? What particular books were you reading? Which ones did you find inspired you the most? One I've been reading at the moment that inspired me is a book called Kristen Lavransdatter by a Scandinavian author from the early 20th century called Sigrid Undset, which is about a woman. It's a trilogy about a woman, and she won the Nobel Prize for it in the 20s. So she's a woman, so you don't hear very much about it, but extraordinary story that combines a profound sort of love for the landscape with the social relationships built into built infrastructure. And it is an extremely clear description of perhaps this idea. So in the second provocation I sent to you, I was asking about this. Is there a little bit of a straw man here, which talks about, for example, the uncaring nature of the alienating suburban domestic realm, which doesn't actually correspond to the reality of the experience of dwelling in it. No, obviously, rather that is a cultural and literary kind of trope that we use to explain the nature of suburbia. But actually, for people within suburbia, in suburban houses, they find themselves tied into a series of other types of networks, which are just as relational and just as, in the case of your book, just as supportive of care and providing of care as perhaps some of the case studies that you use, which are more consciously.
Yes. Well, isn't that just the perpetual dilemma of how amenable and flexible space actually is?
Yeah.
Space. It's quite clear that quite similar sorts of typologies and urban fabrics can actually be inhabited in very different ways and therefore be interpreted very differently as well.
Yeah.
And that ties in with the sense that the architect cannot actually prescribe everything. So and I think that's a dilemma for thinking about care actually as well. It was certainly something I wrestled with, and one of the projects that I wrestled with it in was the Sagafabrik project in the third chapter, which is so specific to individual people and to individual groups that it's in danger of becoming both exclusive by having failed to recognize a particular group, however much the designers and the housing group tried, or of actually building around individual people so specifically that it becomes brittle. So that's I think
really
that's
interesting
the
word to use.
dilemma. That's
Yeah, that's a really interesting word, this idea of brittleness. I really like that, actually. It's but I was thinking about these. So to go back to Balkrishna Doshi and the Aranya housing, you've got this idea of he as the architect, as the designer of the urban realm there, is instigating or initiating an organic process of future development. So he's designing this kind of model of a house which can be, and I wondered whether, and this comes back to your point you're making about how people interpret their environments. A suburban environment could be actually a very rich and rewarding care environment, given other things for certain people. Perhaps. When you're looking at something like the London Olympic Park, you've got an extremely top-down process, which employs sociologists and ethnographers to kind of mediate that. But at the same time, it was going to happen. They were going to spend £30 billion, and it was damn well going to happen come hell or high water, so that some people could run around really quickly. Still haven't got my head around the London Olympics, but anyway. But so how does the organic materialize care more effectively within urban environments? And is the role of the urbanist in this situation to provide a framework in which natural processes of care are more likely to occur, rather than designing care in a kind of clinical way? And I want to get.
Well, I think the Aranya case is a really good one for exploring that, because that's the project in the book that defines least what the end result would be. I mean, literally, there's many of those houses began just as a concrete foundation and a tap, and the means of sanitation, with people being able to build shelters around them, in many cases over time. But attention to environmental conditions and to the organic nature of development in informal settlements is very much there. I mean, there were some extraordinary drawings that were produced by the research team in Doshi's office, characterizing those kind of development processes, and a real understanding too, therefore, of how lanes and infrastructures of pedestrian movement develop in them, and the sorts of land uses that they accommodate, the sort of cultural spaces. So the little temples, the places for hanging out, washing, the social spaces for children to play, cricket and so on, and all of that is there. All of that kind of is there, latent, able to happen. So it's very different from, just a completely infrastructure-led development that might be just determined by the most efficient ways of laying out water pipe work or streets. There's a sort of consciousness of how this thing could unfold, and yet an allowance of quite a bit of flexibility within the framework for the houses to take very different forms.
Is that a lesson that's more broadly applicable? For example, is it picked up? So you talk about Yangel at another point in the book. Is that picked up as a desirable outcome? Is that a universal desirable outcome? Or is that, so this idea of a placed care environment, is that very specific to the context in which Doshi is designing? Does it have broader application? Or how does someone like Yangel, who is seen as being a very good urbanist, with a very kind of a big heart in a way, a very good social conscience and a social focus, is that enabled within his environment? Is that a consideration?
Well, I think a good example, a good analogy, and it's not one that I talk about in the book, but a good analogy is our good old terraced houses in the UK, which have proved to be very adaptable and very flexible, and that, I mean, I know people who've lived in their terraced house for most of their lives. They probably aren't that amenable to mobility issues, given steep stairways and that sort of thing. But they certainly can be reconfigured, and there are so many different examples of them to highlight that. But many of them are not particularly attuned to climate and changing climate and to light and shade conditions and so on. And so I think it's possible to imagine that there could be a real care of, if you like, attunement to those sorts of conditions, to the sort of kinds of spaces that are created, and to the sort of comfort and experience, that sensory experience that they afford, without necessarily foreclosing the possibility that people can chop and change things around and move walls around or knock through rooms and move furniture about. And so there's it's very tricky, because that implies that I mean, that's why the next case study in that chapter is really useful, because there's a kind of generosity to the spaces in that, as well as diversity, lots of different kinds of types that people can choose from. There's sort of ethic of choice, if you like, there, but then there's this generosity and a holding back from prescribing and defining absolutely everything, that gives scope for users to use their own imagination, to create this, to use it to help fashion the sort of social and cultural conditions that they would live in.
But that's where the urbanist's role comes in, isn't it? Because obviously there are these, if you allow that, and I've seen this in informal settlements, and you see this in architecturally designed schemes by leading architects. I'm thinking sort of Number 1 Hyde Park, for example, where you actually get a preferencing through, I mean, that's not obviously an organic environment, it's quite the opposite, but you get a preferencing of a series of assumptions about personhood, which militates against, you might say, militates against caring environments. So the urbanist, the designer, is there to kind of make sure, structure the entire environment so that it doesn't militate against, say, for example, women with prams, people with mobility issues, heavier people, young people, whatever it is, older people, any particular group. So the urban designer has to then create, and that might look like things like ramps that aren't too steep, or it might look like curbs that aren't too high, or are high enough to stop cars parking on them, or it might look like green pathways through cities, or it might look on the domestic scale like ensuring everything is level access. So you can innovate individually within your home as long as there's a downstairs WC and that is accessibly designed with a decent sized door that opens outwards. So it's kind of like, it's a kind of complicated problem, isn't it? And it comes back to this idea around domesticity as well, that the interiority of homes, which is in Fine's book, you mentioned the interiority of homes becomes an actual extension of urban logics of care. Like the threshold of the home has to be mediated by regulation and design.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, absolutely. And of course, in the home also, how care is practiced in the home is very, the state is in that environment too, because of the ways in which the sort of societal norms around who cares and who's responsible, who cooks, who cleans, who takes care of the children. So it's all very much in that environment as well. It's funny, the sort of tendency to regard care as a private matter is actually wrong, because even in the settings where it is most made so, it is the result of societal pressures and expectations.
So I was also wondering about this. So you talk about materiality later on in the book. You talk about this idea of materiality materiality as care, and I wondered if you could unpack that a little bit as well, because I think that's something that when we think about care, we think about building regulations, or we think about kind of technical things that would make care more possible. Like I said, heights of curbs and things like this.
Yeah, well,
There's a much more designerly quality to this as well.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think I found, I found my way into this through sociological literature rather than design literature, and perhaps that's something to address in future work that I might do. But so that it's clear to architects what perhaps more clear what points I'm making. But I found that the sociological literature that I encountered, and there was a book by Christina Booz and Daryl Martin, Sarah Nettleton on materialities of care that came out, I think it was 2018. I talk about it quite a lot in the book. And their starting point was recognizing that in any care setting, it's not just people that are involved in the care, but a whole range of different materials that are involved and that can help somebody experiencing that care to feel more or less cared for. So actually, how a glass of water is presented can be significant in a medical setting.
Yeah.
Or the feel of an instrument, if it's cold, if it's uncomfortable, if it hurts. These materialities, the metal, the temperature, and so on, are really important to the experience of that being invasive or caring, or and so on. So I found that a really helpful way of thinking from a different disciplinary perspective about care and in the context of design. And it was really thanks to that book that I started to approach the themes and the chapters in the way that I did. And they talk about materialities as including those sorts of things like tools and furniture and things in an environment, and settings that start to get into much more the sort of spatial characteristics of places, how a waiting room, for example, might be configured, and how crucial that is to the experience of waiting, to the sort of emotional resonance of that experience, whether it's anxiety provoking, whether it's actually a social space, whether it feels connected to other places, whether it feels connected back to everyday life in some senses. And I think I talked about that a bit in the context of the case study in Singapore in chapter 4. Especially waiting rooms, for example, because there is one in that chapter. Yeah. So that's how materiality started to come into my work.
Yeah.
And then I started, and then that was the point at which I realized that it was possible to talk about design, as I went on to do towards the end of chapter 2, in that sort of way, as involved in care, if you like, on the one hand. So with the sort of the materialities of design, the products of design, being involved in care and shaping the experience of that care through the way that they're configured, but also design as a process as being key because of all the different sets of relations that are involved in the production of any particular project, and therefore being part of that care in a sense.
Yeah. I really like this idea of I like the word materiality. I think it confuses people. I think people reject it a little bit because it sounds a bit like saying materials plus sticking something on the end to make it sound cool. But I like that it implies design consideration, and I think that's a really important part of what you do in these stories of these cases, is that you demonstrate how the architect's intention to be caring is realized through the process, the normative, shall we maybe call it the normative process of design, which is, as you've said, is co-productive, relational, group work. It is group work. But I was wondering also whether that all started to indicate things around aesthetics. Is beauty a component of care in design? is this an important aspect? The way things look, the way that light comes in a window, the way that the materiality of a wall is enhanced or subdued by natural or unnatural, mechanical, electrical lighting, or fire, or whatever it is this something that we might start thinking about as well?
Well, not in terms of a sort of theory of aesthetics that would be prescribed, then it wouldn't be. But in terms of a more experiential, situated, alert to the reality of the person, of personhood, if you like, and the differences and, well, profound differences in the way that people perceive things, from the way that they perceive sounds to the way that they perceive light and color. So again, care introduces all this complexity and consciousness of difference and subjectivity. So I think beauty is really important because people perceive it, and but I think it's really related to the sensory experience that people have of place, and it's incredibly variable and culturally specific, as well as individually, as well as related to individuals.
Yeah, individuals as socially situated beings, not as in Ayn Randian fountainheads.
I mean, of course, you know, when we sit around in a crit looking at, or a review looking at student work, we will often say it's such a, the drawings are beautiful, and we seem as tutors to know what we mean, and that's partly our training, it's partly our, it's our experience. Yes, exactly. It's our hubris, our arrogance. But it's also to do with a set of other things that it would be good to tease out more closely about the balance between different elements, the use of color, the clarity of the image, the adherence to certain conventions. But I think in terms of architecture, I think there's a real need to tease out how people, especially people who are going to live in places, really experience them, the sort of aesthetics from their perspectives.
I mean, yes, I think it's really, I think it's going to give me a lot of ammunition for going into the coming academic year in terms of how I kind of engage with the students. And I actually genuinely think that this could be your work is part of a wonderful growing literature around decontaminating that abstraction that high modernism, perhaps late modernism, certainly, and the way, things like the high-tech kind of way that city centers have been being developed. We can start actually challenging that in a kind of meaningful, empirical way. And I think that's a really delightful, a really wonderful part of this book.
Thank you. Well, I think there's that kind of, I think the idea of a theory of practice is quite good too, because it's not theory as in an abstraction. It's a sort of theory as in trying to think about what caring means in a particular context, and very aware of complexities and contradictions, and of the need to constantly understand it through everyday reality and through the specificity of case studies. I mean, that's what I think is very strong about the sort of the feminist idea of the case study, of being able to focus on something quite specific and situated, go into a lot of depth, and then draw out something from that is of wider relevance, but constantly alert to the contingency of that, to the capacity for new knowledge to come to light, for new ways of thinking to emerge, and for the conversation and the story, if you like, to keep unfolding.
Fabulous. What a wonderful point to stop on. Thank you so very much, Juliet. That was a really, if you had planned a conclusion, that was a beautiful one to have. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. That was a really nice conversation. I enjoyed that a lot.
Hot dang, ain't that a thing. Thanks to Juliet for her excellent book and to Bristol University Press for the ebook. Please see the podcast description for links to Juliet's profile, the book, and a link to a YouTube video of Juliet speaking during a symposium on designing cities for all. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share A is for Architecture everywhere. Cheers.